We can start, sir.
So good morning, everybody. So I'm Dr. Taranath Yas, Assistant Professor at Ramaya Medical College in the Department of General Medicine. We'll be talking about ECG changes that we come in day-to-day. So we see a lot of electrolyte imbalances and various drugs. People will be having multiple comorbidities, so they'll be on multiple drugs. So what are the ECG changes that we see with these real lifetime scenarios? So this is what I'll be talking about today. So coming to the introduction, ECG gives us vital information about the electrical disturbances which are caused by various metabolic parameters. Today, we are just sticking to electrolyte disturbances and various drugs. Of course, certain endocrine conditions, hypothyroidism, hyperthyroidism. So all of these have their own findings on ECG. Today, I'll be talking only about electrolyte disturbances and a few drugs which can cause the ECG changes. So it's important to know these changes as you will be coming across these quite often in the hospital setting. To be aware of the ECG changes which can result from normal or overdose of a drug, and to know the ECG changes during a temperature alteration. So coming to the electrolyte imbalances, chiefly the potassium, calcium, and the magnesium ions are the ones which will cause the ECG change. Both the hyper and hypo will cause. Sodium usually does not cause any ECG changes, both hyper and hyponatremia. So magnesium behaves very similar to both potassium and calcium. So I'll be talking about only these four in today's session. So I put up a few case scenarios. I would like it to be more interactive. So I'll read the case scenario now. A 65-year-old woman presents to the emergency department with generalized fatigue and palpitation. She was started on ACE inhibitor 2 months ago, but has missed her follow-up appointments. What life-threatening metabolic abnormality could be responsible for the findings shown in a ECG tracing? So I'll just read this out for all of you. So there is tall T waves which are visible here from V4, V5, V6, and you can see that there is QRS prolongation here, and also a bit of a PR prolongation. So this is possible in hyperkalemia. So patient was previously on ACE inhibitor. So ACE inhibitor will inhibit the RAS pathway. In the RAS pathway, there is certain potassium is excreted. So the excretion of potassium is impaired. Because of that, the potassium is retained inside the body, and that will cause hyperkalemia. So these are the characteristic findings seen in a patient of hyperkalemia. These are the tall T waves here. You can see the PR prolongation and the QRS prolongation in the lead 2. So what are the characteristic ECG findings in a hyperkalemia patient? Increased or tall peaking T wave, prolongation of the PR interval, flattening of the P wave, loss of P wave, prolongation of the QRS complex, and the sine wave appearance. So these are the same graphical representation, the same of all these findings which are seen in hyperkalemia. So now this is the normal P waves, and then later the P wave can disappear, cause bradycardia, and QRS, which is normally less than 0.11 second, and start broadening, which is, and when unchecked, when the potassium unchecked, it can lead to a sine wave pattern, which can predispose to a condition called as ventricular fibrillation. So the ECG changes seen with hyperkalemia are directly proportional to the level of the potassium. So normal potassium level is 3.5 to 5.5 millimoles per liter. So between 5 to 6 of P wave and the PR prolongation, and between 7 to 8 we start seeing the widened QRS complex, and beyond 8 we see the sine wave pattern and ventricular fibrillation. Remember that it is directly proportional to the level of potassium in the blood. So potassium is chiefly an intracellular cation. The normal value is 3.5 to 4.5 millionths per liter. Action potential, I'll just tell you briefly about action potential. So every cell has its own resting membrane potential. So similarly, a cardiac cell also has its own resting membrane potential, which is of around minus 90 millivolt. The phase 0 is called as depolarization. The phase 1, 2, 3 is called as repolarization. And why is this called as depolarization? Because there is already a polarity, a negative polarity, and that is becoming zero. So it is losing its polarity, and that is why it's called as depolarization. But this depolarization mechanically translates into the contraction of the cell or the activation of the cell, and this is phase 0. The repolarization is whatever polarity it has lost, it starts regaining it. So what is 0 starts becoming negative again. So that is why this is called as repolarization. Mechanically, this is equivalent to the relaxation of the cell, the inactivation of the cell. Now, something which is negative has to become positive. So for this, the sodium, which is chiefly an extracellular cation, has to start coming inside the cell to make it more positive. So what is negative predominantly should become positive or zero, so that the sodium has to come inside the cell. So that happens by opening of the sodium channel. So the depolarization is achieved by the opening of the sodium channel, and the repolarization, meaning something which is positive should become negative. So the intracellular cation, the positive ions inside this happens by the exit through the potassium channel. So the potassium channel opens up, potassium, which is chiefly an intracellular cation, starts going out. So something positive is going out of the cell makes it negative. That's why there is a decline. However, there's a plateau phase. This happens because when the potassium is moving out, also the calcium is coming in. So there are two cations, one cation going out, one cation coming in. So they are negating each other. And that is why there's a plateau phase. This is the phase 2. Phase 3 is when this calcium channel gets closed. So there's no further influx of the calcium, but the potassium efflux continues. So potassium, which is going out from inside the cell, continues, and thereby making a negative potential. So this phase is called as repolarization, 1, 2, 3. So you can, so now you know why potassium has a lot of these changes. So usually the potassium change, both hyper and hypokalemia, have effects on the repolarization. Now on the ECG, we know that repolarization changes in the different causes of hyperkalemia. So pseudo hyperkalemia, there's no, something called as, so these are directly from Harrison. So I have just considered transcellular shift and inadequate excretion. So pseudo hyperkalemia is when the potassium is falsely elevated. This can happen by the lysis of the cells. I told you the potassium is chiefly an intracellular cation. So whenever there's a lysis of any cell, the sample is not being taken processed immediately. So you draw blood, but the sample is carried and processed after 3 to 4 hours. Then the cell can get lysed, and the potassium which is inside the cell can get leaked out. So this is called a pseudo hyperkalemia. However, this will not cause any ECG changes. The next two main broad headings of hyperkalemia will be transcellular shift and inadequate excretion. Transcellular shift is in cases of acidosis, there can be hyperkalemia. So whatever is inside the cell, the potassium starts coming out of the cell and thereby causing hyperkalemia. So this happens in acidosis, radiocontrast, mannitol, beta-2 antagonist, digoxin, and tumor lysis syndrome. So and tumor lysis. So inadequate excretion. So potassium is not getting excreted properly. So this happens in inhibition of the RAS pathway. So like we saw in this previous example, so patient was on ACE inhibitor or ARB. So this inhibits the RAS pathway, and RAS pathway, the end product aldosterone should cause sodium reabsorption, potassium excretion. When this potassium excretion is blocked, it causes hyperkalemia. Decreased distal delivery, like in cases of congestive cardiac failure and volume depletion. Hyporeninemic hypoaldosteronism. This can happen in diabetic nephropathy, SLE, CKD, chronic kidney disease, NSAIDs, and cyclosporin, renal resistance to mineralocorticoid, advanced renal insufficiency, that is chronic kidney disease or end-stage renal disease. It could be because of any cause. So whenever the kidney is not functioning properly, the secretion doesn't happen. So the potassium is retained inside the body, and that will cause hyperkalemia. And primary adrenal insufficiency, like in cases of tuberculosis in India commonly, or autoimmune in the West, or Addisonian because it could be iatrogenic because of inadvertent use of steroids in India. So these are the chief causes of hyperkalemia. So in real life practice, we come across acidosis, inhibition of RAS pathway, decreased distal delivery, hyporeninemic hypoaldosteronism, CKD, and adrenal insufficiency. And of course, a few times of tumor lysis conditions. So these are the chief things that you need to remember in case of hyperkalemia, to remember hyperkalemia. So what is the cause of all TVAV in this tracing? Is it hyperkalemia, myocardial ischemia, or a normal variant? Anybody can volunteer?
Sir, this is probably secondary to myocardial ischemia because there is. So this is probably secondary to myocardial ischemia because the T waves are tall, they are symmetric and wide, and the peak is flat and not sharp.
Yes, very good, Balaji. That's right. So this is probably secondary to myocardial ischemia. Like I told you, in case of hyperkalemia, it looked like it is pinched out. So there will be a very thinned out or a peak, even the base will be narrow. Whereas in myocardial ischemia, the base will be broad. Like you see here, the base will be broad and it's not clearly a tented or a peaked thing. So it's a bit broad even at the end of the T wave. And how to differentiate between these three. So in a normal variant, you see a slow upstroke and a rapid downstroke. It is not symmetric. So when I superimpose this over the ECG that we see in hyperkalemia, a slow upstroke and a rapid downstroke, and it is not symmetric at all. Whereas in the case of hyperkalemia, it is symmetric. It will be a tented T wave and there is a narrow base. Reflective ischemia and hyperkalemia get symmetric. The base is broad here, narrow. Even the peak is not as sharp as what we see in hyperkalemia. So these are the three different tall T waves that we can see and that we need to differentiate. So coming to the second case scenario, a 32-year-old woman with a history of hypertension and asthma is on albuterol, atenolol 25 mg twice daily and 25 mg hydrochlorothiazide. She is admitted to the hospital with a diagnosis of exacerbation of asthma secondary to bronchitis. So this is the ECG. Can anybody tell what this is? Okay, so I'm going to, so first of all, reading the ECG boxes between two QRS complexes here. So 300 by 4 will make it 75. And it is called sinus rhythm whenever there's a P wave preceding the QRS complex. And coming to the axis, we see the equiphasic lead. So here it's the AVL, and the lead perpendicular to AVL will be lead 2, predominantly positive, meaning it's around 60 degree. Axis will be around 60 degree. And then you go on looking at the morphology of each wave, the P wave, the QRS wave, the T wave, and the intervals, PR interval and the QT interval. U wave here, U wave here. U waves can be normal. It can be seen even in normal people, but when it is significant, when it is then it is a characteristic finding that we see in hypokalemia. Right. So the U wave, when it is prominent compared to the T wave, then that is characteristic of hypokalemia. Now in this patient, why we are suspecting hypokalemia? Patient is on more than one agent which can cause that. Thiazide. Patient is also on beta agonist albuterol. Both of these can cause hypokalemia. So the typical ECG changes may appear when serum potassium concentration is within normal limit, meaning that even when the potassium is normal, you can see the typical ECG finding of hypokalemia, meaning the U waves are still present even when the potassium is normal. And conversely, the ECG may be normal when serum potassium level is very low. So even when the serum potassium is 3, the ECG finding may not be, it could be like a normal ECG. Unlike hyperkalemia, these additional changes are not related to the degree of hypokalemia. I told you in the hyperkalemia, it is directly dependent on the level of potassium, whereas in hypokalemia, it's not dependent on the level of the potassium. So what are the characteristic findings? Flattening of the inversion of the T wave, increased prominence of the U wave. So it's not appearance of the U wave, prominence of the U wave. So compared to the T wave, the U wave must be prominent. And this increased prominence of U wave is a characteristic finding. Slight depression of the ST segment, increased amplitude and width of the P wave, prolongation of the PR interval, prolongation of the QTC interval, premature beats and sustained ventricular tachyarrhythmias. So these are the characteristic findings that we see in hypokalemia. So remember the U wave, prominence of the U wave, flattening of the inversion of the T wave, and depression of the ST segment. Just remember the top three: flattening or inversion of T wave, prominence of the U wave, and the depression of the ST segment. So this is another ECG. So you can see the U wave here. So it's more prominent than the T wave, and it is getting even more prominent with hypokalemia. So this is the U wave here. So the U wave becomes very prominent with disappearance of the T wave. So I told you that the T wave, flattening or the inversion of the T wave. So the T wave which was visible is getting disappearing. So this flattening or disappearance of the T wave prominence hypokalemia. So what are the different causes of hypokalemia? 3 broad headings again: decreased intake, redistribution into the cell, and increased loss. Decreased intake because of starvation, redistribution into the cell, all the causes of all the modalities, how we treat hyperkalemia, all of these can cause hypokalemia. So how do we treat hyperkalemia? We give beta agonist, we give insulin, we give soda bicarb. Of course, we don't use soda bicarb alone. Whenever hyperkalemia is associated with acidosis, then only we give soda bicarb. And of course, we give calcium gluconate in case of hyperkalemia, but as a membrane stabilizing agent. So all of these can cause hypokalemia. The modalities which are used for treatment of hyperkalemia, basically the soda bicarb, metabolic alkalosis, insulin, beta agonist, alpha antagonist, theophylline, and anabolic state. So whenever a person is on vitamin B12 or folate supplementation, that can cause hypokalemia. Total parenteral nutrition and hypothermia can cause hypokalemia. Increased loss, so it could be non-renal or renal. Renal is because of diuretics or mineralocorticoid excess, magnesium deficiency. Mineralocorticoid, as I told you, sodium reabsorption, potassium excretion. So the potassium excretion will cause hypokalemia. And non-renal is because of diarrhea and sweat. So this is broadly how to remember the causes of kalemia. So coming to the third case scenario, I want somebody to volunteer for this. 24-year-old male patient who was recently diagnosed of acute myeloid leukemia was started on chemotherapy. His investigations are as follows. Hemoglobin is 11, total count is 43,500, platelet of 1.5 lakh, creatinine is 1.2, sodium is 132, potassium is 5.8. The following is his ECG. So this is the ECG. What are the ECG findings? I'll go back to the case of acute myeloid leukemia, started on chemotherapy. HP11, total count 43,500, creat 1.2, sodium 132, potassium 5.8. What are the ECG findings? What further investigations do you need? What's your diagnosis? Anybody?
There is QT prolongation seen in the ECG with ST segment predominantly by affecting the ST segment.
Very good.
And with the background of an acute AML going into, we are thinking of a tumor lysis syndrome in the background, sir.
Very good, Balaji. So what are the components of a tumor lysis syndrome? What are the disturbances that you see?
Hyperkalemia, hypocalcemia, hyperphosphatemia, high phosphate, and hyperuricemia.
Good. Yes, hyperuricemia, hyperkalemia, hyperphosphatemia. So all the intracellular ions will get released into the circulation and thereby increases its level. And you see hypocalcemia because the calcium phosphate product is constant. So the calcium is inversely related to phosphate. Whenever phosphate is high, calcium will be low. So there will be hypocalcemia. And there is QT prolongation, like Balaji pointed. So QT interval is the time frame taken from the beginning of the QRS wave up to the conclusion of the P wave. So the entire period is called the QT interval. Now QT interval should always be corrected because it can, with increase in the heart rate, the QT is also, QT can get wrong. It shortens in the actual ECG, but we should always take the corrected QT interval because that gets hidden in cases of tachycardia. So in this patient, the ECG or the rate is around, again, 300/4, around 75 beats per minute. So definitely the QTC will be more than the actual QTC. So here the actual QT will be, so one big box, two big box. So it's around 10 small boxes, and which when corrected will definitely be more. So corrected QT interval. So normal QT interval is 390 to 430 milliseconds in cases of males and up to 450 milliseconds in case of females. So we call QT prolongation when it is more than 450 in male and more than 460 to 470 in case of females. So the corrected QT interval is given by the Bezet's formula, which is QT duration divided by root of RR interval. RR interval is nothing but the duration between the two QRS complexes. So the duration between these two in seconds will give the RR interval. So QT divided by the root of RR will give the corrected QT interval. Now another thing that you can remember is, so cardiac cycle. So in 1 minute, if there are 60 beats per minute, then each cardiac cycle is taking 1 second. So that 1 second, so that RR interval will become 1. So that is why the QT C is equal to QT whenever it is 60 beats per minute. And when it is more than 60, each cycle is taking less than a second. So it could be 0.8 or 0.7 second. So meaning if the heart rate is around 80 beats per minute in 60 seconds, each cycle is finishing less than a second. So it will be a root of 0.8 or 0.7. So that time the corrected QT interval will be more than the actual QT that is visible on the ECG. That's why in cases of tachycardia, we always need to, not just in tachycardia, even whenever there is you're suspecting QT prolongation, you should always look at the corrected QT interval. So like Balaji pointed out, in the previous issue, there is QT prolongation, which is a classical finding of hypocalcemia. And apart from that, there can be terminal T inversion. And QT interval represents the ventricular recovery time. And the corrected QT interval is given by the Besset's formula. So what are the causes of hypocalcemia? There are two ways to learn this. One is, there are only two broad headings. One is low parathormone condition and high parathormone condition. So we know that parathormone is directly proportional to the calcium level. Whenever there's low calcium, the parathormone gets stimulated, and the parathormone will increase the calcium level. So it increases the calcium level by osteoclastic activity on the bone, increasing the reabsorption in the kidney, increasing the absorption of calcium at the gut level. So parathormone increases the calcium by these three mechanisms. So if there is low calcium, it means the parathormone is low. But it could be low, meaning that there is a direct primary hypoparathyroidism condition, or there is a secondary hyperparathyroidism condition, where I told you the main stimulus for parathormone is the low calcium. So in the background of low calcium, the parathormone gets released. Okay, so low parathormone condition, it can happen in case of agenesis. The parathormone is not formed, or it could be destroyed because of surgical, radiation, infiltration, or autoimmune conditions, or reduced parathyroid condition like in cases of hypomagnesemia. So parathormone is not produced, is not formed properly, or it is destroyed. So parathormone is not functioning properly. So the calcium reabsorption, calcium absorption, and the calcium, the bone resorption is not happening, and thereby causing hypocalcemia. Or high parathormone conditions, meaning it is a reflex. So calcium is low, parathormone is high because of the hypocalcemia. So like vitamin D deficiency. So vitamin D is low, so calcium phosphorus is low. So the reabsorption of the absorption is low because there is low vitamin D. So because of that, there is a secondary hyperparathyroidism. So this is primary hyperparathyroidism. So parathormone is not functioning. Here there is secondary hyperparathyroidism, which is because of the hypocalcemia causing secondary hyperparathyroidism, or a parathormone resistance syndrome, meaning at the receptor level, the parathormone is not able to act. And that is why the parathormone is not causing its actual effect of hypercalcemia, but in turn causing hypocalcemia. This is called as pseudo hyperparathyroidism. And then calcium chelators. So drugs, calcium chelators will cause the, so the calcium gets bound to it, and thereby causing hypocalcemia. Bisphosphonates. So bisphosphonates are the drugs which are given to prevent the osteoclastic resorption of the bone. So by giving bisphosphonates, it causes hypocalcemia. And other miscellaneous conditions like acute pancreatitis and rhabdomyolysis can cause hypocalcemia. Now it's important to know entity called as Torsades de Pointes, which is nothing but a type of ventricular tachycardia in the background of QT prolongation. So Torsades de Pointes is twisting around a point. The meaning of Torsades de Pointes is twisting around a point. So you can see that first of all, it's a different morphologies. The QR has a different morphology. It is twisting around the isoelectric line. It's not staying at one isoelectric line. See, it is changing from one point on one line to another line. So, and apart from that, there is a short, long, short cycle. So there is a short cycle here, there's a long cycle here, there's a short cycle here. So why I'm talking about QT, Torsades de Pointes is because we just spoke about QT prolongation. So any drug or any electrolyte disturbances that cause QT prolongation can lead to Torsades de Pointes if left unchecked, and also conditions like inherited long QT syndrome. In people with inherited long QT syndrome, by using certain drugs or by these electrolyte disturbances, it can lead to this condition called as Torsades de Pointes. So that is why it's important to know what are the drugs which are causing QT prolongation. So I'll be talking about these drugs now here. So there are a few antiarrhythmic drugs like class 1A and class 3. So class 1A is quinidine, disopyramide, and procainamide. Class 3 is sotalol, amiodarone, ibutylide, and dofetilide. So these two, class 1A and 3, will cause QT prolongation. Remember this, class 1A and 3 will cause QT prolongation. Class 2 is beta blockers, class 4 is calcium channel blockers. These generally have their effect on the PR interval, not on the QT interval. So the QT interval is basically by the class 1A and class 3 group of antiarrhythmic drugs. Apart from that, very commonly used drugs are these, what we use in our day-to-day practice: macrolides, azithromycin, erythromycin, erythromycin. So all of these macrolides can cause QT prolongation. Fluoroquinolones, levofloxacin, moxifloxacin, gatifloxacin, clindamycin, chloroquine, and hydroxychloroquine. So that is the reason why during the COVID time we were told not to use HCQs along with azithromycin. Both drugs can cause QT prolongation, and when both are used concurrently, it can cause further QT prolongation and in fact lead to a condition like Fawcett's pointers. Cotrimoxazole or trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole is another drug which can cause QT prolongation. Antifungals like ketoconazole or itraconazole, amantadine, which is an antiviral, all of these can cause QT prolongation. So these are quite commonly used drugs. Of course, we use levofloxacin, azithromycin day in and day out. So these can cause QT prolongation. So always remember to look at the QT interval, which is the duration at the beginning of the QRS complex till the end of the T wave, and always look at the corrected QT interval, which is given by the Bazet formula, which is QT divided by the root of RR. Okay. And coming to the antipsychotics, alloperidol, phenothiazines, tricyclic antidepressants. Of course, we use tricyclic antidepressants, and very commonly, this is another drug which can cause QT prolongation. And antihistaminics like diphenhydramine, hydroxyzine, and clofenadine also cause QT prolongation. So I'll just brief you about antiarrhythmic drugs classification and the ECG changes. I'll just finish off the drugs here because I just spoke about the QT prolonging drugs. So as I told you, 1A and class 3, that is quinidine, procainamide, disopyramide, and class 3, which is sotalol-amiodarone, will cause QT prolongation. Apart from QT prolongation 1A, there's also decreased T wave amplitude and increased U amplitude. Class 1B is lidocaine, phenytoin, mexiletine. This do not cause any ECG changes. 1C is flecainide. This will cause wide QRS complex, thereby marginally increasing the QT interval. So because the QRS complex is also part of the QT interval, it is only marginally increasing the QT interval. Otherwise, generally, it doesn't really increase the QT interval. And I told you beta blockers and calcium channel blockers will increase the PR interval. PR is prolonged in cases of beta blockers and calcium channel blockers, which are antiarrhythmic drugs, class 2 and class 4. So 1A and 1C will cause QT prolongation. Class 2 and 4 will cause PR prolongation. Class 5 is all the miscellaneous drugs, adenosine and multiple other drugs. So coming to the case scenario number 4, 76-year-old male with no known comorbidities presents to medicine OPD with history of backache and easy fatigability. Routine blood workup revealed a hemoglobin of 9.2, WBC count of 10,300, platelet of 1.5 lakh, creat was 2.1, calcium was 10.5, phosphorus was 3.2, LFT was normal except for a low albumin of 2.1. So I've given the ECG, what are the ECG changes and what's your diagnosis. So this is the ECG, but before the ECG, we need to make a clinical provisional diagnosis. So somebody, can you give me the explanation for this? Anybody? Anybody? Elderly man coming with back pain and easy fatigability is found to have anemia. He has no comorbidities. What is creatinine is 2.1. So there's unexplained kidney failure or kidney injury.
Maybe myeloma, sir.
Correct. It could be myeloma. Now, what is the calcium in this patient?
Approximately 12.02.
Hello? How do we check the corrected calcium?
So, 4 minus albumin into 0.8 plus the serum calcium level. So in this, it came up to 12.
Yeah. So 0.8 and
comes up to 11.3, sir.
Good. So it comes up to 11.3 to 11.4. So that is definitely not 11.3, I think 12.3. See, the formula is 10.5 plus 0.8 times 4 minus 2.1. 4 minus 2.1, assume it's 2. So 0.8 into 2 is 1.6. So 10.5 plus 1.6 will be around 12.1, if I'm not wrong. 12.1 to 12.2. Okay, so definitely it's a hypercalcemic range. So here the ECG finding is shortening of the QT wave. So this is the QRS complex and this is the T wave. We do not see that QT segment at all. So QT interval is of course the duration from beginning of the QRS up to the end of T wave, but we do not see any segment after the QRS complex in the beginning of the T wave. It's looking like as if the QRS is continuing into a T wave. There is a rapid continuation of the T wave. So this clearly tells that there is a QT shortening. So this can happen in cases of hypercalcemia. Okay, so this could be a case of multiple myeloma because there is no comorbidities, patients present with anemia, hypercalcemia, and creatinine of 2.1. So everything fits, and there's a reversal of AG ratio. So most of these features fit into high possibility of multiple myeloma, and the ECG definitely there is QT shortening, which could be seen in hypercalcemia. So what are the classical ECG changes of hypercalcemia? There's a short QT interval. The proximal limb of T wave acutely slopes to its peak. HT segment may not be apparent. QRS amplitude may be increased in extreme hypercalcemia. Also, biphasic T waves and northbound waves can be seen. You don't have to remember the QRS amplitude part. Remember the short QT interval. The proximal limb slopes to its peak acutely. HT segment may not be apparent. All these things are we saw in the previous slide. So what are the causes of hypercalcemia? Like I told you, parathormone will cause hypercalcemia. So excess parathormone production, it could be primary, tertiary or ectopic production, or hypercalcemia of malignancy. In lung cancer, there is PTHRP, parathormone related peptide, which can cause hypercalcemia. Myeloma, breast cancer, because of its bone metastasis, can cause hypercalcemia. Excess 125 dihydroxy vitamin D production. So this can happen in granulomatous conditions like sarcoidosis, tuberculosis, or vitamin D intoxication. Primary increase in bone resorption, which can happen in hyperthyroidism and immobilization. Excessive calcium intake in cases of total parental nutrition, and other conditions like adrenal insufficiency, pheochromocytoma, and thiazides. So remember, thiazides are notorious to cause hypercalcemia. So I finished with electrolyte imbalances and few of the drugs which cause QT prolongation, and also a class of antiarrhythmic drugs and the ECG findings in all of those antiarrhythmic drugs. One thing we need to remember is the digitalis. Of course, we don't use it very often these days, but digoxin is a drug which still a lot of people are using, and we need to know the ECG changes when we start somebody on digitalis. Digitalis is commonly used to treat cardiac failure and slow the ventricular rate in atrial tachyarrhythmias. It causes characteristic ECG changes from the digitalis effect because the recovery or repolarization of the myocardial cells occur earlier than it normally does. So the classical findings, somebody is on digitalis, it's called the digitalis effect, and it is the curved ST depression, flattened T wave, and decreased corrected QT interval. So this curved ST segment or curved ST depression is typical classical for digitalis, right? So you can see the same thing here, curved ST depression. So this is also known as the reverse stick appearance, or also known as the Salvador Dali appearance. So I think now we all know it more commonly because of the Money Heist series. So the Dali mask or the Salvador Dali, he was basically a artist in Spain. He's a Spanish artist. So he had this mustache which was tailing upward, and that is why it was called by his name. So this curved appearance or a inverted tick appearance of the ST segment is classical for digitalis. We should also know the digitalis toxicity. Digitalis is a drug which is narrow therapeutic index, and people will be on it for a longer time. So if you do not monitor, it can cause any type of arrhythmias. Digitalis can cause any arrhythmias. Whatever we know, it can cause, starting from premature complexes, VPCs, up to atrial fibrillation or ventricular fibrillation, anything it can cause. So chronic toxicity in patients on digoxin therapy may result from deteriorating renal function, dehydration, electrolyte disturbances, or drug interaction. Hypokalemia can precipitate arrhythmias at therapeutic levels. So even when it is in its normal therapeutic level, hypokalemia can precipitate the toxicity and result in arrhythmias. Alteration in the cardiac rate and rhythm from digitalis toxicity may reproduce almost every known mechanism of dysrhythmia, meaning it can cause any arrhythmias whenever there is a digitalis toxicity. So what are the common symptoms of digitalis toxicity? So it can be divided into CNS symptoms, visual, GI, and cardiac. CNS, drowsiness, lethargy, fatigue, headache, dizziness, giddiness, seizure. Visual, photophobia, decreased visual acuity, anorexia, nausea, vomiting, weight loss, pain abdomen, palpitation, shortness of breath, syncope. So it's quite vague. So any of the symptoms can be there. Most common extra cardiac manifestation will usually be nausea, vomiting. So nausea, vomiting are the usual presenting symptoms in cases of digitalis toxicity. So moving on to the next case scenario, a 74-year-old man with mild dementia presents to the emergency department with worsening confusion. His medication include omeprazole, aspirin, simvastatin, and digitalis. He lives alone at his home, and his daughter comes to visit once a week to lay out his weekly medications. What life-threatening condition could be responsible for the findings shown on his ECG tracing? Anybody? So what is evident is it is not regular, right? I think everybody agrees that it is not regular. And secondly, the P waves are not really visible. So there is some sort of junctional arrhythmia, and there is some sort of conduction block. So you can see that there are more QRSs here, sparse here. It's not regular. So there is a conduction block 2:1 year and 4:1 year, 3:1 year. So this is junctional rhythm with varying conduction block. This can happen, any type of arrhythmia can happen for that matter in case of digitalis toxicity. Now here again, so this is another ECG. So you can see this classical reverse tick appearance or Salvador Dali appearance of the coved ST segment in case of V4, V5, V6. Excuse me. So this is seen in people on digitalis, and you can also see the ventricular premature complexes here. So these are VPCs. So VPC also can be seen in digitalis toxicity. So in the background of coved ST, we see any type of arrhythmia, always suspect a digitalis toxicity, get its levels and start the treatment for digitalis toxicity. So sagging ST depression is clearly evident in lead 1, 2, 3, AVF, V5, V6. In lead 1, 2, 3, AVF, V5, V6. V5 and V6. So, and also there are VPCs, and this suggests the possibility of a digoxin toxicity. Coming to the last entity of today's class, hypothermia. So temperature below 35 degrees Celsius or 96 degrees Fahrenheit is called as hypothermia. Now, again, this hypothermia can be divided into mild, moderate, and severe. Mild is 32 to 35 degrees Celsius, moderate is 28 to 32, and severe is when it is less than 28 degrees Celsius. Now, clinically, this Osborn waves, the characteristic Osborn wave starts appearing at around 32 degrees Celsius, meaning almost when it is moderate hypothermia. And in general, to remember the ECG, all the intervals, be the RR interval, be the PR interval, the QRS interval, the QT, may lengthen. All the intervals will lengthen. The characteristic Osborn wave appears as a deflection at the J point in the same direction as the QRS complex. So at the end of the QRS complex, beginning of the ST segment is the J point. So that is, so there will be a deflection at the J point in the same direction, and this is named as the Osborn wave. The height of the Osborn wave is roughly proportional to the degree of the hypothermia. So the height is directly related to the level of the hypothermia. So the severe the hypothermia, then it will be taller. The most common rhythms in hypothermia are sinus bradycardia. Like I told you, all the intervals will be prolonged, meaning it can result in bradycardia, junctional bradycardia, and atrial fibrillation. Another important thing is because there is hypothermia, the patient will be shivering, so the artifact will be quite visible on the ECG screen. So you can see this QR at the end of the QRS, you've seen this J point thing. This is called as the Osborn wave, right? So this is in the direction of the QRS wave. So, and it is directly proportional to the level of the temperature. So usually this starts appearing at around 32 degrees Celsius, a moderate hypothermia. And of course, what is most striking in this ECG is the bradycardia. So there are definitely more than 5 large boxes, meaning it is less than 60 seconds. The heart rate is less than 60 per minute, right? So these are the findings in cases of hypothermia. So all you need to know is definitely there are life-threatening conditions in whatever we've discussed today, like hyperkalemia, hypokalemia. Both of these can be life-threatening, and QT prolongation, like in hypocalcemia, that can cause Torsades pointers, which can cause ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation and cause death. And long QT syndrome, certain drugs, like all of us were aware during the COVID time not to use HCQs and azithromycin concurrently because it can cause QT prolongation. And so we need to be aware of these intervals. So your basics will need to be important. You need to be very strong in the basics, how to calculate the QT interval, from what point, and what is correct QT interval. So unless your basics are strong, you will not be able to pick these up. You should be aware that there are a lot of things that we come. So there's somebody who's on diuretics, somebody who's on spironolactone for the CLD or the chronic congestive cardiac failure. So that itself will be causing certain conditions like hyperkalemia. So we need to be aware of all these electrolyte disturbances, the ECG changes in all these electrolyte disturbances, so that you are able to pick it up and save lives. Any doubts? Any questions? Balaji?
Sir, one question I had was, how do we distinguish hypocalcemia from a hypokalemia? So, because both cause a widened QT interval. Is there any way that we can use?
See, you cannot you cannot differentiate hypocalcemia ECG from hypokalemia. In like we told, UF, prominent UF can be seen in hypokalemia, but it is very difficult to differentiate just that based on the ECG, that you cannot tell that this is hypocalcemia and this is hypokalemia. Both are almost same. You can have prolongation both, you can have prolonged intervals in both, but the prominent UF is more commonly seen in cases of hypokalemia.
Thank you, sir.
Any questions, anybody? Okay, Balaji, should we end the class?
Yes, sir. I think we can end. No questions even on online.
Okay. Okay. Thank you all.